Hi, I'm Jean Feraca. This is the Ideas Network of Wisconsin Public Radio. For those of you who didn't get to see the PBS feature film that was broadcast on Christmas Day, The Boyhood of John Muir, here's a recap. The story is familiar. An immigrant boy, in this case Scottish, struggles against all odds and wins. This is the story that really comes home for Wisconsinites. In John Muir's case, the story means breaking away from a tyrannical father and from the back-breaking drudgery of growing up on a 19th century farm on the Wisconsin frontier. Young John does this through sheer genius. His gift for invention guarantees him a chance to make a fortune in a country ready to industrialize. But fate, in the form of a factory accident, the incident that with which the film begins, actually becomes the epiphany that occasions John Muir's choice of vocation. In the factory, he loses his sight, and during his convalescence, he decides not to continue with his course of invention, but to go on to become the founder of Yosemite National Park, the first president of the Sierra Club, and America's founding father of environmentalism. He followed his love of nature, and this was in direct opposition to his father's puritanical bias against wilderness, believing that all wild things, including his own son, were infected with the devil. What's interesting to me is that although this is Lawrence Hott's first feature film about John Muir, he's actually now at work on his third film about this great environmentalist. Larry Hott and Diane Gary have produced 15 award-winning PBS programs, many of them devoted to the wilderness idea. The Wilderness Idea was a documentary about the early wilderness battle between John Muir and Gifford Pinchot. And then they produced Wild by Law, about the underpinnings of the Wilderness Act of 1964. They are now at work on a documentary about the 1899 Harriman expedition to Alaska. Larry Hott, it's a pleasure to have you back with us.
Thanks, Gene. It's good to be here.
Why this devotion to John Muir?
I like John Muir because he is a good soul. He is somebody who seems to be perennially happy. And he had every excuse to be a sad and depressed and mean person. And he triumphs over that natural feeling, because that feeling would have come from the way he was brutally treated by his father and the work, the almost needless work that he had to do on the Wisconsin frontier. And yet he overcomes all of that and becomes a great American hero, and he does it always with good humor. He's a fun person, and this is why I've been working on him, on films about him, now for about 12, 13 years, and I'm not tired of him yet. There's always something there, something more. You know how people talk about biographers having to really like their subject, otherwise they can't work with them very long. Well, I like John Muir. I would like to have known John Muir. He seems like a funny, friendly person, and there's always something there for me to discover.
Now, how heavily did you rely on John Muir's own autobiography in creating the film?
The story of my boyhood and youth is the autobiography that John Muir dictated to Edward Harriman's secretary in 1908. And we relied on it very heavily. A lot of the actual language in the film is taken directly from that book. Some of the quotes of John Muir we turned into dialogue in the film. And the basic storyline is there. This is the most dramatic part of John's life. The idea that he is taken out to the Wisconsin frontier, which he thinks will be a lark. He gets to leave school in Scotland, travel across the United States, thinks that he's really going to have fun on the frontier with his brothers and sisters.
How old was he at that time?
He's 11 when he leaves Scotland, and he writes about Scotland as being a wonderful place. School wasn't too bad. His family, contrary to what a lot of people believe, his family was fairly well off. His father had some money. He ran a dry goods or grocery store. in Dunbar, Scotland, which is on the east.
Why did they leave?
Well, his father was a Campbellite, which was a certain sect, Calvinism. And he wanted to join other members of the sect in the New World, where they thought that they could practice their religion more freely. It was part of an idealistic movement. They were actually heading towards Canada when they found out that there was better land in Wisconsin. And in fact, where they settled up in the Portage area, there were plenty of other people of their persuasion. And in the film, we have a prayer meeting scene, which is what John Muir's father used to do. He used to go out and lead these prayer meetings. He was a lay minister.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of what John writes about is being forced to learn the Bible, in every phrase of it. And if he didn't know it perfectly, he would be whipped. He was whipped for almost anything. One of the things we pulled back from in the film is actually showing the whipping. We filmed the whipping scenes. Mm-hmm. But when we showed them to our test audiences, and we wanted children and families to be able to enjoy this film, the overtones of child abuse were just too great. So
they come through loud and clear in the incident of his having to dig the 80-foot well.
Right, which in the film, of course, is only a few minutes. In the book, he devotes quite a bit of time to that because he always resented his father after that. And we have some of that in the film, where he's lying in bed recovering, and he indicates to his mother that he is not willing to forgive his father for what he has done.
Mm-hmm. So that was one of the questions I had. What was his attitude towards his father in the autobiography?
He is not very forgiving of his father until the very end. What I mean by that is the end of his father's life, when he's a very old man, and John comes back to see him as he's dying, and he is invited by his brothers and sisters to come see the father and reconcile. And it's very difficult for John to do that. In the film, we do have John talking with his father after he regains his sight, which did happen. John went back to the farm to see his father. We sweeten it up in the film to really, it's poetic license there, to pull it all together and make it more understandable, I guess, for a family audience. But the reality was that John and his father had a very testy relationship even after John had been injured and lost his sight. And John's about to leave on the 1,000-mile walk, and what really happens is that his father asks him for rent. He asks him to pay him back for all the years that he's lived at home as a child. Mm.
Was this a ruse to try to keep him from taking off?
I think it might have been. You get that feeling that his father realizes that he has been so cruel that his children are going to leave him, and in fact, they all leave one by one. Not one of them stays on the farm because none of them can stand the father.
Mm-hmm. I found it fascinating to see the old man come through in the sun.
Well, if you're talking about the film, it was a conscious attempt on our part to try to match up two actors where you could actually believe that they were related, and also that there would be some characteristics between them that they would share. So physically, we matched up two taller, red-haired actors, one Ken Drury, who was a well-known Scottish actor, and the other one, Gary Hollywood, who plays John Muir, who was an up-and-coming Scottish actor. He's 16 years old at the time we made the film. Ken Drury, by the way, is the person who does the voice of John Muir in the Wilderness Idea documentary. And we thought that was a nice turnaround, to take somebody who had participated in an earlier film about John Muir, who knew him and understood him, and then have him actually play John Muir's nemesis, his father, in this one.
Well, what I had in mind was this streak of ferocious attachment to an ideal that strikes me as having its source, perhaps, in John Calvin himself.
Yes, I think that John does take on some of the characteristics of his father, his directedness, his cathecticness, I guess one might call it, where he holds on to ideas and doesn't let them go. You can see it later on in his battle to save the Hetch Hetchy area of Yosemite National Park, which was about to be turned into a reservoir, and he fought for many years, 5 years against it, and lost that battle. But John Muir was a religious man, and his father taught him that religion. But what's interesting is that he didn't take on the mean-spirited characteristics that his father wanted him to have. That denial that there's anything beautiful in wilderness, that his dislike of social amenities. John takes the good part of the religion, and he also creates out of it almost a new religion. Many people nowadays think of either love of environmentalists or working very hard to preserve the environment as a new religion.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of terms for it. Deep ecology is one of those terms.
Yeah.
And Michael Cohen, in his book, The Pathless Way, about John Muir, attributes a lot of this to Muir's writings, where he puts people on the same level as animals and plants and nature in general.
Mm-hmm.
Muir becomes a friend of Emerson later on, and all these ideas mix up together in transcendentalism. So John takes this old world Calvinistic attitude and turns it around in the New World. He takes it in a new direction, and because he has the energy and the intelligence and the great talent as a writer, he is able to bring this to the American public.
I'm so glad you said that. Suddenly I understand something that I've always been puzzled about and had inklings about, but never could quite put my finger on. First of all, where does this idea, this Calvinist idea of nature as evil and wilderness as suffused with the devil, with Satan, come from in Calvinism?
Well, I'm not a biblical scholar, but I can tell you that what John Muir's writing talks about is that it's in the Old Testament, that we have to subdue nature,
Mm-hmm.
And there are many biblical passages about this. Now, you can interpret the Bible in many ways. You can also look in the Old Testament and see places where we are told to preserve and protect,
mm-hmm.
And not overuse things. But people are very selective in those ways. You also have to understand that the time that this was happening was a time when America was seen as a never-ending land of plenty.
Mm-hmm.
There was always another tree. There was always another river. We were not going to run out of it. The population of the United States at the time that they come here is, I don't know, maybe a fifth of what it is now, maybe less than that. So it was many years before people were conscious that we were coming up against a scarcity of resources. Frederick Jackson Turner doesn't publish his Turner thesis, saying that the frontier is essentially closed until 1893. And John Muir starts his journeys around America in the 1860s.
Mm-hmm.
He's really quite prescient. He and George Marsh, who was up in Vermont writing about this, were some of the few people who were saying, we better watch out. We're going to run out. So the question that you asked about the Bible is really one of interpretation, and John Muir interprets it in a 180-degree different way than his father did.
But it's like Calvinism in verse.
Yes, exactly. It turns it on its head. And
I've always thought that there was something really fundamentally religious about the American wilderness idea.
Oh, it is. And this is what's interesting about what's happening in the last 20 years in the environmental movement, is that most of the people in the environmental movement, I don't think, would consider themselves religious people. You know, these are not people who are spiritual in their day-to-day life, who would consider themselves churchgoers, or even, maybe they wouldn't even be affiliated. But they have a certain religion, and their religious attachment is to nature.
Yeah, and man is evil.
Yes, well, this is where you see it actually coming out in some of the eco-terrorism.
Yeah.
So I think that there's actually a certain danger in taking this to the extreme.
Yeah. Well, you see, there's this fanaticism that you can see running all through this.
Right. I would not label John Muir, however, as a fanatic. I think some people take his writings and use it as a basis for fanaticism. But John Muir is actually a fairly reasonable person. He's a curious guy. I have said that John Muir was the Horatio Alger story, the typical self-made American man who all of a sudden wakes up one day and realizes that that's not the direction he wants to go, that he could have been a millionaire with his penchant for great inventing. But when he has his accident, when he loses his sight, he's lying in bed for 6 weeks, which is a scene we open and close the film with. That he has this epiphany, and he realizes that he doesn't want to spend another day inside working, is one thing he says. And he wants to get out and explore and see the things that were made for man's eyes by God. But John Muir later on, when he does settle down, he gets married at the age of 42. He takes over Louisiana Strensel's father's fruit farm in Martinez, California, and he turns it into another $1 million American dream operation. And he does become a millionaire, and he settles down for a while. So John Muir is a very curious American character in that he gives up the American dream completely for a long time, many decades, and then comes back to it and recreates it for himself.
Now, how much of his life do you think did he spend wandering as a solitary in the wilderness? I mean, when the film leaves off, he's about to set off on foot for the Gulf of Mexico.
Right.
And from there, he kept going.
Well, he actually spends from about 1867 to about 1880. So what is about 13, 14 years of traveling around. A lot of that time spent alone in the Sierra. He's one of the reasons he's legendary. He's one of the reasons he's called John of the Mountains is that he would go up with a light blanket and a mule and some nuts and bread in his pocket and spend months in the mountain. But people have this image of him as just sort of hiking around. Really, what he was doing was research on glaciology. And the reason that we know who John Muir is that he started publishing, and he started proving geologists, famous geologists, wrong about their theories about the formation of Yosemite National Park. And he started getting a lot of good press. The first time he published was in the Overland Monthly in 1872. He's 34 years old before he starts writing. And then he writes voluminously. I mean, he's got hundreds and hundreds of works. There is a wonderful book, which is a concordance of John Muir's writing. It's a several hundred-page book. It's called A Reading Bibliography by William Kynes and Mamie Kynes, which annotates and pulls quotes from his hundreds and hundreds of books and magazine articles. This is the way to get to know John Muir, to see what of his prose survives. Some of it's too purple. Some of it we just can't stand to read now. But a lot of it is as accurate and topical now as it was when it was written.
We're talking with Lawrence Hott, who directed The Boyhood of John Muir, the feature film that was aired nationally on PBS on Christmas Day. If you'd like to join us with your own questions or comments, 263-1890 is the local number. Please use it if you're joining us from Madison or Milwaukee, 263-1890. Otherwise, the toll-free number is 1-800-642-1234. I'm Jean Feraca. This is the Ideas Network of Wisconsin Public Radio.
Laughter is the best medicine, and you'll get a healthy dose Saturdays on Zorba Pastor on Your Health. Hi, I'm Dr. Zorba Pastor.
And I'm Tom Clark. Every week we kick back with listeners from around the country for some lively talk about health and fitness.
And have some fun along the way. Join in Saturday mornings at 8 and Saturday afternoons at 1 on the Ideas Network.
Pat and Patty will join us tomorrow at 9 to talk about how to achieve your New Year's resolutions. And we have Greg joining us from Oregon.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. I'm listening to the show with interest, and I just wanted to give a little bit of information. I guess in the town of Oregon, the Historical Society, as part of the Sesquicentennial, had a project that was called Immigrant from the Immigrant to the Internet. And some of the local lore that has sprouted up in this is that John Muir taught at one of the local town schools. It was one of the district schools out in the township prior to the establishment of the village and the what is now the Oregon Area School District. And I don't have any more information other than that. I can just tell you that he did, I guess when you were talking about his wanderings and such, I'm just wondering if you know anything more about that.
Yeah, that sounds vaguely familiar. Do you have any idea what year that might have happened?
I can't tell you for sure. I could just say that the first records from the school were dated in 1849, and the school expanded in 1865. I'm not really certain during that period exactly when it was that he taught. I know he was, I believe he was attending the university at the time and came out, I don't know if it was an internship or exactly what it was.
Yes, I think he did need to earn extra money and did do some teaching at the time. He never did finish school. But there was a great story about the janitor at the University of Wisconsin who used to take people around to see John Muir's inventions, which he left there, including his famous study desk, which is my favorite invention of his. I have a mock-up of it in my living room. It's what we used in the film. It would get a book out for a set amount of time, give the reader 10 or 15 minutes to read it, then close the book and get out another one. And when John Muir went back to the university one time, the janitor was still there, and delighted in taking John up to his old room and to show him that he had preserved it up there. And that study desk is in the lobby of the State Historical Society in Madison.
Oh, gee, that's great. I didn't know that. I got a kick out of the fact that so many of his inventions bespeak the virtue of industry, and are against laziness. That the chair that kicks you in the butt if you sit in it too long, the bed that dumps you out at 6 a.m.
Well, what John was trying to say, I think, in these inventions, was that we shouldn't take our ideas about the economy too seriously, and I think about our own economic actions. I think this was part of his rebellion against his father. Remember, the reason he's inventing these machines is that his father tells him that he can't stay up late at night reading, but he can get up early to read. Well, John fools him by getting up at 1 a.m. to read. But it's too cold and too dark for him to read, so he starts tinkering with these inventions. So it makes sense for him to make time-saving devices, or to make devices that mock time-saving devices. So he does make the self-feeding cow machines, which allows him to sleep in bed. And at the same time, he invents a chair that tells you to get up and not be loafing. So those things are contradictory, but they're all jokes.
I see. Well, how did he manage to preserve such a great sense of humor, in spite of the fact that the physical hardships of the frontier life were enough to make you grumpy, and let alone having this awful father?
I think he just, all you can credit him for is having a wonderful personality, and that he was strong enough to overcome what his father did to him. He also had 6 brothers and sisters. And I'm just inferring here from what he's written that they must have all banded together and helped each other. In the film, and this is a low-budget film, so we could only afford 4 brothers and sisters. But we have his wonderful sister Sarah there, who's played by Joanne Bett, who's a brilliant Scottish actress, and she shores him up, and she helps him get off the farm. She encourages him. And when he's on the farm, he also has the Yankee. The Yankee is a real character. What I mean is he's a person that John writes about, besides himself being a character. And he is played in the film by a man named Colin Bruce, who's an American actor living in London. And the Yankee, in the story of My Boyhood and Youth, brings John books. And John gets books from neighbors. And in fact, his father even lets him keep a couple of these books. We have a great scene in the film where John's father discovers him reading a science book. He says, "I told you could read, but I didn't say you could read this." And John bests him in that argument, and he tells him that if I'm not allowed to read, then how am I going to learn how to make glasses, for example? And if I can't learn how to make glasses, how am I going to read the Bible? And so this is one of the first time he can get at his father, and he gets at his father with his intelligence, because he's never going to beat him, his father, at his own game, which is being brutal. It's almost Gandhi-like. Gandhi realizes that you're never going to beat the Brits with guns, so you have to beat them with civil disobedience. Well, John beats his father with intelligence and not with brutality.
Claire joins us from Grafton.
Hello. Thank you for taking my call.
Thanks for calling.
Interesting show. I'm kind of interested in the glaciology aspect that John Muir studied. He was from Wisconsin. He would have been very interested in what has been learned in Wisconsin since his time, with the plate tectonics and the glaciers and the sulfide deposits that have been discovered. And I'm thinking of the Crandon deposit, of course, which is actually, the level of that is above some of these outwash debris that's up there, and the pollution can travel through this outwash plain, which was where the glaciers drained, corner of 2 great lobes of the glaciers from 10,000 years ago. And this sulfurous deposit is poised right there and can get into the groundwater through these outwash deposits. So it would be nice if people would take this opportunity of learning about John Muir and learn more about their own state and its glaciers.
How did you become so knowledgeable?
Well, I have a copy of the environmental impact statement that was written in 1986, just before Exxon pulled out. And they're working on the new one now, and they're arguing about these things right now.
Mm-hmm.
And the DNR is looking at what the mining company said about the glaciology of the area, and it really needs more work because they're not characterizing it right. You know, they're trying to explain it away.
Mm-hmm.
But it's it's a subject that people have to look at and learn about, and not relegate to history. You know.
I'll give you an example of how important John Muir's glaciology work is for us now. He went to Alaska 7 times before he joined the Harriman Alaska expedition in 1899, and he was mapping the glaciers then without the satellite geopositioning services that we have now. But the measurements that Muir and his fellow scientists took then are being used now to give us a sense of how much the glaciers have retreated, and these are used in an analysis of global warming. So all those records from that period are extremely important, and John Muir was one of the leaders. Even though plate tectonics hadn't been discovered at the time, he was one of the leaders of the glaciology studies in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s.
Mm-hmm. Let's get the big picture for a minute. He's attributed with having founded the environmental movement, which is probably one of the most significant philosophical movements of our time. It's interesting that 3 of the great environmentalists are all associated with Wisconsin. John Muir the first, Aldo Leopold, and Sigurd Olson.
Right.
What is it about this part of the country, and what is it about the American wilderness in particular, that inspired this movement? And would you say it is a significant international movement at this time?
Well, Bill Cronin, who is a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin, recently did a lecture asking just this question: why Wisconsin? Why do these people come from Wisconsin? And Bill himself is from Wisconsin and is one of the great writers on the American West and the environmental movement. So he's continuing the tradition. Also, Frederick Jackson Turner was at the University of Wisconsin. There's a lot of speculation about this. Part of it is just coincidence. Part of it, I think, has to do with the University of Wisconsin being there, which has been for a long time a center of Western studies and American history. So these people gravitated to the university. It was just luck that John Muir lands in Wisconsin, and Aldo Leopold comes there to work for the U.S. Forest Service. But once they're in Wisconsin, there is something about it, and this is probably something better for your Wisconsin callers to speculate on, but what it is about the Wisconsin area that caused these people to be so concerned about the environment, as opposed to, say, another Midwestern state.
So we're going to pose that question and see what kind of response we get?
So he's continuing the tradition. Also, Frederick Jackson Turner was at the University of Wisconsin. There's a lot of speculation about this. Part of it is just coincidence. Part of it, I think, has to do with the University of Wisconsin being there, which has been for a long time a center of Western studies and American history. So these people gravitated to the university. It was just luck that John Muir lands in Wisconsin, and Aldo Leopold comes there to work for the U.S. Forest Service. But once they're in Wisconsin, there is something about it, and this is probably something better for your Wisconsin callers to speculate on, but what it is about the Wisconsin area that caused these people to be so concerned about the environment, as opposed to, say, another Midwestern state.
So we're going to pose that question and see what kind of response we get? I mean, to people who might want to call in.
You know, there are the other half of your question, which is about how important it is internationally. Well, just look at how much press the Green Party gets in Germany. And we now have a Green Party in the United States, and Green Parties are popping up all around the world. So you can directly trace these political movements to John Muir. And, of course, Thoreau and Emerson and George Perkins Marsh Aldo Leopold and the Wilderness Society. They're all connected, but John Muir really gets it going in the United States by not only writing about it, but by being a political activist.
And also by moving west.
Yes. He takes it west, and of course, the West is the locus, I guess, of that political activity. The irony is that the battle that begins it all, the first great battle for wilderness, the Hetch Hetchy battle, was a loser.
What was it that he was trying to accomplish?
Well, if you can imagine Yosemite, most people have an image in their mind of the big valley in Yosemite with El Capitan and Half Dome and these big, beautiful mountains, and then the Tuolumne River running through it. Then you have about 50, 60 miles away, further higher up elevation, another valley called Hetch Hetchy. And it's a mirror of the lower valley. It looks very similar. It has very similar mountains, and it was just as beautiful. And it was perfectly positioned for San Francisco's water supply. All you had to do was put a dam at the end of it, fill it up, and you can take care of San Francisco's water supply for centuries to come. And Gifford Pinchot, who was the head of the Forest Service, supported this plan. And he had been a former friend of John Muir, so they had come up against each other over the question of sheep grazing on federal lands. And by the time Hetch Hetchy came around, he was a real enemy, John's, even though Gifford Pinchot was a great conservationist. And this is where you see a big split in the environmental movement, conservation versus preservation. You will rarely see, I think, any head of industry in the world not call themselves a conservationist. But it's very rare to see somebody call themselves a preservationist.
What's the difference?
Well, the preservationist is somebody who says, don't touch it. Leave it alone. The wilderness movement comes out of the preservationist ideal. The idea, one of the ways of defining a wilderness is that it's a roadless area. And roadless meaning that you can't get heavy equipment in there to develop it. You can't log it. I just heard a report recently that there is no place in the lower 48, continental United States, that is more than 20 miles from a road. So there's very real, true wilderness left in the lower 48. And Alaska really is the only part of the United States that has vast stretches of roadless areas anymore. But the consciousness about that and the idea that we should set aside land, and that only Congress can take it away, which is what the Wilderness Act said, comes directly from John Muir saying to us that there is value in completely wild things.
How many Europeans do you think travel on a yearly basis to Yosemite?
Oh, there are exact figures I couldn't tell you, but I know that it is in the millions. That if one goes to the Grand Canyon or Yosemite or any of the other national parks, that the number of Americans is matched by the number of Germans and Japanese and English and French. That these are the big tourist sites in America. And why? Why is that? Well, America doesn't have anything that's old except for the land. The painters, the Luminous movement, the Hudson River School, Albert Bierstadt, one of the best known of those, were painting these great American monuments, the natural landscape, and not the ruins, which was what was being painted by the landscape masters in Europe at the time. They would always position a ruin in their picture. But the ideal of the sublime in the United States would become a tree, a blasted tree, off in the corner by some great area like Niagara Falls or Yosemite, and symbolizing the power of God and the presence of God in nature. And that's what America has to offer. Europe was completely cut through, well, there was very little forest land left in Europe at the time that John Muir came over here. In fact, there was very little forest land left in the east coast of the United States when John Muir got here. All the east coast states had been logged. And the west was the last frontier, and John Muir was able to see the closing of that frontier personally.
Richard joins us from Illinois.
Good morning.
Hi.
John Muir certainly was a great Scottish individualist, rugged individualist, and idealist. And in the movie I saw Christmas Day in one of the down periods of his early life, I believe it was his mother, related to him a story of Robert the Bruce in Scotland. Robert the Bruce was hiding in this cave from the English, and he sees this spider trying to spin a web, and the spider tries 6 times, fails. Finally, the 7th time it succeeds.
Right.
And so supposedly that was an inspiration for him to go on his own individualistic way, and it also pointed out in the movie he was something of an inventor in those early days too. And of course he took this one idea to the Wisconsin State Fair, and so I kind of I like to compare him sort of to Jack London, who was also up in the wilds, like in Alaska, wilds of Alaska. Of course, London was more materialist. Maybe he was hunting for gold too in his lifetime. Muir wasn't doing that, but it actually, of course, conservation, preservation didn't get off to a big start until you get these heavyweights like T.R. or Teddy Roosevelt involved, you know.
Right.
And so anyway, he did his part to conserve the natural resources of this country in a great big way. John Muir.
That's interesting. The Teddy Roosevelt connection is interesting because Gifford Pinchot, who was John Muir's enemy by that time, had Teddy Roosevelt's ear. He was the head of the Forest Service. He could talk to him anytime he wanted. And Teddy Roosevelt came out and rode around Yosemite with John Muir and became a friend of his. And this war between the preservationists and the conservationists was fought out in Roosevelt's mind. And Roosevelt had the ability to stop the building of the Hetch Hetchy, but he didn't. He declined, and it went ahead. Some people say that's what killed John Muir. He dies a year later from pneumonia, but people say it could have been a broken heart.
We're talking with Lawrence Hott, director of The Boyhood of John Muir, which was broadcast on Christmas Day on PBS nationwide. I'm Jean Feraca. Questions that we've been posing. Why Wisconsin? What was it about Wisconsin that engendered the environmentalist movement and 3 great environmentalists who really are credited with having led it? John Muir, the first, followed by Sigurd Olson and Aldo Leopold. What is it about Wisconsin itself? If you'd like to join us, the number to call, 263-1890, 1-800-642-1234. Also, what was it about growing up on that frontier farm near Portage that could have inspired so much love of nature in a young Scottish-American boy?
If you want to hear talk on current issues from a variety of perspectives, stay tuned to the Ideas Network. You'll find knowledgeable hosts and guests talking about timely topics, and we open the phone lines for your questions too. Keep informed by following the talk all week long on the Ideas Network of Wisconsin Public Radio.
Energy-efficient home building in Wisconsin is the topic after 11, when Jim Packard welcomes 2 guests to talk about a new 3-part video series produced by the Energy Center of Wisconsin. How cold was it on that frontier farm where John Muir grew up, Larry? You didn't make too much of that in the film.
Well, we do make a bit of it because that's the what precipitates the Yankee being fired, because he is so upset that Daniel Muir is working his children to death in the cold. But the father would not let them light the fire. He would only let Daniel Muir, the father, lit the fire so he could read the Bible, but the kids and the family did not have the benefit of that warmth. You live in Wisconsin, you know how cold it gets. It was brutal. But they had but they also had wonderful things. That John was very happy when he had time off. His father did teach him to swim. There were thousands of sandhill cranes around. There was great wildlife. John Muir would occasionally actually go out and hunt. His father, in spite of his meanness, did let the kids have a pony and a dog, which we cut out of the script because we could not afford the animal training for it. But it wasn't completely 100% painful for John all the time, and there was time to explore, to get out into the wilderness. And this might be part of the answer. This is one of the things Bill Cronin says about why Wisconsin was such an influence on these people. It was relatively undeveloped for a long time. It had a great area in the north where for hunting and fishing. There was not a large population center except in Milwaukee, so that the people who lived in Wisconsin had access to nature all around them, yet it was a place that was very well developed. It was not isolated. So you had an intellectual life in contact with the wilderness, which is a good combination for those things.
Chris joins us from Rochester. Go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, I think part of the reason that we have so many environmentalists coming out of this state so early on was, I mean, it's the state itself, it's the landscape. There's something about an oak savanna near a swamp in the middle of winter like it is today. I mean, there's a stark beauty that really, I think it's more of a spiritual thing, and I think it moved a lot of people in that fashion to where they decided to choose that sort of as their life's passion.
I wouldn't disagree. If you read a Sand County Almanac, Aldo Leopold's diary, his time up in Baraboo, you get that sense that it is the landscape that he is writing to. It's almost a love song. Mm-hmm. And so I would agree with you. Although I think people from other states would call in and say, "Well, what about my landscape?" I'm so curious what differentiates it, from a landscape in a neighboring state that has similar attributes.
I don't know. I'm very biased. I love Wisconsin, but there's a warmth that I don't think you can get from a coastal seashore or a mountain range. I mean, they're both beautiful, but there's something very, I don't know, it's spiritual about. There's nothing that...
I'm not going to let you get away with that. It's too easy. What do you mean by spiritual?
You have a sense that this is attainable, I guess. I'm not wording this right.
Accessible.
Accessible, and, I mean, you can't own a mountain. You can't own a seashore, but a 40-acre swamp with some oak trees...
Okay, now what makes that spiritual?
You can walk out... It's not a big... I mean, when you think about Yosemite or Hatteras off the coastal Carolinas, those are long journeys, and you can't... They draw a lot of people, but, I mean, just going through the sand country around Portage and that, it's accessible. You can get in touch with it easier, and whether you just come and visit or if you decide to purchase and somehow get tied in with it a little closer in a sense. Mm-hmm. It's like I say, I don't want to say it borders on religious, but I know a walk in the winter and at night through woods is horribly refreshing for me. I mean, it just clears my head and you just feel like you belong. And where Yosemite or some of these other great national park sites are at, that's more like a cathedral where you're going to, but you come back to your small town church and worship on a weekly basis. If that's a good analogy, I'm not sure.
That's a very interesting analogy. What do you think about that, Larry?
I think that there's something more. It's that if you didn't have the beautiful and accessible landscape in Wisconsin, these people might not have become the great environmentalists they were. But I think there's also something about community. There must have been something about the combination of people in that area, so that you had that intellectual stimulation that forged these ideas. And perhaps I think when you look at what was happening with these people's lives too, that for Aldo Leopold as an example, he was in a very stimulating environment at the University of Wisconsin. He was doing very interesting work, and he had the support of his entire department and all the graduate students who work with him. And that was, you can't discount that. John Muir was in an area where, because his father had come out here with these other Campbellites, he was constantly asked this question of how is he going to live his life? Is he going to become a strict Calvinist like they are, or is he going to embrace nature? So these things will all involve people, not just the land. And one of the reasons I really liked John Muir is that he was a people person. Even though he would go off and spend 3 or 4 months alone in the wilderness, he was known as a great raconteur. And you can't be a raconteur unless you know how to talk to people. One thing, just before we run out of time, I want to make sure that people want to get the Boyhood of John Muir film. It's available from Bullfrog Films at 800-543 3764, and it's called The Boyhood of John Muir.
Okay, Rose is next from Nisita. Go ahead.
Good morning, Gene and guest. I've had so much frustration in my personal life since I've lived in Wisconsin. It's like I've been trying to get out. But just as your program this morning just makes me stop and think how what a really great state this is. And, like last week I watched a bald eagle catch a fish not 2 miles from our house, and I have a albino raven that lives in the neighborhood, and I watched a flock of sandhill cranes go over. It was when it was still really nice out when we were out one Sunday, and then I was thinking, well, when Robert Redford came to Madison, to stump for Senator Feingold, and it's like, well, he's a prominent environmentalist in Washington, D.C., and also the Rocky Mountain states, and it's like, why is he coming to Wisconsin? And I know that, well, you've got the environmental decay there, and I think something about Senator Feingold being an environmentalist. But then on to your question, why is Wisconsin the center? To me, in my opinion, when the Dutch bought New York from the Indians, from that moment on, along the eastern seaboard and down into, the southeast, it's been populate and produce. And then on the ever since now, and look at the environmental hazards and waste they have that they're battling out there on the East Coast. Then you go out to the West Coast, and they've been mining. Well, I mean into the West, Rocky Mountain states, and the West, but they've been mining for a century, and they're trying to clean up that. And then you go into California, which is a wonderful state, but it's then again it's populate and produce because was such a wonderful state and attracted so many people. Then you get into Minnesota and Iowa, and they're a farming state because of the prairie. And then you have, the environmental hazards to do with that. But then you get to Wisconsin, and they haven't mined. They're trying to keep mining out of the state now. Although I could be wrong. They might have been that copper mine, and I can't recall where that's at. But, it's rocky, it's hilly, it's forest, and it just wasn't such a environment for producing. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I don't know if I agree with you in that the North was certainly cut over. The great pine forests were decimated along with everything else that was cleared, and the land in the South was plowed. It was cultivated to a fare thee well, and I don't see this pristine, untouched wilderness, frankly.
Well, maybe not as well. That's true, and because I didn't think that I get real nervous when I'm talking to you, so I'm not thinking real clear. But that is true what's been done. But I live not far from where Aldo Leopold lived, in the Sandhill. What do they call it? The Sandbelt or whatever. And there's really not a lot except for potatoes. I mean, although that is, well, you're right, because Wisconsin River from north and Wisconsin Rapids has, greatly polluted the Wisconsin River. I guess, again, there's the alert that you're not supposed to eat fish out of the river right now.
Yeah. I actually think it all comes down to an idea, and this was Bill Cronin's great point. Nature itself is an artificial construct. It's not what it is so much as how we perceive it.
And you think that these people happen to perceive it in a certain way in Wisconsin for whatever reasons, that they were in a certain climate at a certain time. We left out one person, was Gaylord Nelson. And there's a direct connection between Gaylord Nelson and this film. He's the founder of Earth Day.
Yes.
He's a senator from Wisconsin, and is still very involved with the Wilderness Society. This film came out of an idea to produce an after-school drama for students, for children, for Earth Day. And eventually it evolved into something else. But here we have another connection to a great Wisconsin person, and who was, in this case, related right back to John Muir. The Sesquicentennial Commission helped support this film for the 150th birthday of the state. And I think they recognize that John Muir is a favorite son. And so, if Wisconsinites want to look at something that tells them a lot about themselves, John Muir, although he went off to California, really is one of the most important people in American history. I don't think we would have the kind of political scenario we have now in America if it hadn't been for John Muir.
Kim joins us from Waukesha next. Go ahead.
Hi, Gene. I agree with your last statement. I think the reason that Wisconsin is in the forefront of conservation or preservation activities is that not only did John Muir and people like that have great ideas about this, but they left behind a reservoir of people who carried on. My grandfather, for instance, was very active in the early movement and was contemporary with John Muir, and so it got me interested, and I hope I pass that on to my kids.
I see.
That's my comment.
Very good one.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. And Larry Hott, thanks so much for being with us again.
Thank you, Gene, as always.
We'll look forward to the next one.
Thank you.
Anyone wishing to purchase a cassette copy of this program on John Muir, the radio store number is 1-800-747-7444. Ask for program number 1230E. Carmen Jackson produced the program. I'm Jean Feraca. We'll talk again tomorrow.